tudo bem? Seja muito bem-vindo, muito bem-vinda, muito bem-vinde a mais uma entrevista exclusiva da Revista Zelota. Hoje nossa conversa é com o escritor estadunidense Carl Weinberg. Carl é professor de História Moderna dos Estados Unidos na Indiana University Bloomington e autor do livro Red Dynamite, ou Dinamite Vermelha, que é exatamente o tema central da nossa entrevista. No livro, o autor pretende apresentar para as pessoas leitoras como desde o início do século XX nos Estados Unidos houve uma articulação entre movimentos apologéticos criacionistas e antiteoria da evolução e movimentos políticos anticomunistas. Como veremos durante a entrevista, dois elementos são muito importantes para compreender essa articulação entre criacionismo e anti-evolucionismo e anticomunismo propriamente dito. O primeiro foi o chamado caso Scopes, no estado de Tennessee, nos Estados Unidos, em que um professor foi acusado criminalmente pelo delito de ensinar teoria da evolução. O segundo é o foco em um autor que era adventista do sétimo dia, chamado George Price, inclusive que cunhou a expressão dinamite vermelha para se referir aos perigos da teoria da evolução e sua relação com o comunismo. Com sua abordagem, podemos perceber as raízes de certo movimento que se constitui como uma guerra cultural propriamente dita, articulando não só questões religiosas ou teóricas, mas também as mobilizações políticas efetivamente, entre trabalhadores, movimentos contra os trabalhadores e que se potencializa ainda mais, claro, dentro do ambiente da Guerra Fria. Respire fundo, vem com a gente e não se esqueça de apoiar a Revista Zelota e o jornalismo crítico independente.
Okay, so Professor Carr, could you first, in general terms, tell us what is creationism or the creation science movement, and how is it related to anti-communism?
Creationism, broadly speaking, is the idea that God created the heavens and earth and all of nature, including us, of course, and that might seem to be just a generic kind of Judeo-Christian belief, or really any kind of faith tradition. But creationism, as we usually refer to it, refers to an idea developed to counter claims that all of this evolved over time, probably by itself, and not necessarily requiring the help of a deity. And, you know, in my book, I am fully aware that there are many people who identify as theistic evolutionists, that is, people who believe in evolution that was aided by God in some way. That position is quite popular here in the States, certainly among my students when I teach a course on this topic. But in the book, I focus mainly on those who deny that evolution took place at all. And I also tend to focus on the evolutionists who are asserting that evolution took place without any kind of God. So that's broadly speaking what creationism is, but creation science is something much more historically specific. In this country, it refers to a way of promoting creationism that arose primarily after World War II in connection with Henry Morris, John Whitcomb Jr., and the Institute for Creation Research. And it was really sparked by their 1961 book, The Genesis Flood, which is actually sitting on the bookshelf in back of me. And in that book, they offered what they said was a scientific case for the idea that the Earth is only about 6,000 years old, that the flood from Noah's time in the Bible was a universal flood and accounts for all the geological features of the Earth. So they recruited real scientists, that is, people who had PhDs in science, people like Duane Gish, who had a biochemistry doctorate from University of California at Berkeley, as well as others, and this continues today. That is Answers in Genesis, the primary creationist organization today that built a multi-million-dollar creation museum in Kentucky. They continue to have on their staff people who have genuine scientific credentials, even though one could say they're not using them for scientific purposes. So creation science is that venture to to use science to validate the claims of creationism. So your other question, what does this have to do with anti-communism, which I know is the reaction of a lot of people when they see my book, because they don't seem to be connected. Well, I would preface it by saying this, that the typical arguments against evolutionary science, going back 100 years, are, in my mind, three. One of them is that evolutionary ideas are contrary to the book of Genesis, contrary to scripture in various ways. A second argument would be that evolutionary science is bad science. That is, there are gaps, there are no transitional species, there are all kinds of problems. Radiocarbon dating doesn't really work, etc. So it's bad science. The third objection, which is the one I focus on in the book, I think is the most powerful and influential, although not well recognized by scholars, not taken seriously, which is that belief in evolutionary science makes you behave badly. It makes you do bad things. The classic formulation is, if you believe you're descended from animals, you'll act like animals. And although this idea may seem ridiculous to secular-minded people, I would say it's been highly influential among Christian believers, Christian conservatives, evangelicals, certainly creationists in the US and I'm sure in many other parts of the world. I venture to say, including Brazil. And so my book takes a look at one strand of this kind of thinking, the idea that ideas have consequences, that thinking this way makes you act in certain ways. It, by the way, has a scriptural basis in Matthew 7:15, a passage about evil fruits and false prophets, and the idea that evolution is an evil fruit that produces all kinds of bad behavior, and that we judge the validity of ideas by the way it makes you act, by your fruits in the world. And so I've actually coined a name for this kind of argumentation. It may not catch on ever, but I call it fruitistic thinking, that is judging ideas based on the consequences in your actions and behavior. In any case, what I've identified in the book is at least a strand of that thinking that attributes communism, socialism, and allied immoralities, as creationists have described it, that attributes these things to evolution. And this is a connection that, again, most secular-minded people or pro-evolutionists think is ridiculous, is silly, is stupid, but I think is worth serious scholarly attention. And so I've written a book about it. And I guess one other thing I'd add is that the origin of this kind of argumentation I identify as a book by George McCready Price, a Seventh-day Adventist and amateur geologist, who wrote a book in 1925 called The Predicament of Evolution, in which he explicitly uses the terminology that became the title of my book, Red Dynamite. He's got a whole chapter on how evolution is connected to socialism and communism and political revolt. And he made some statements in there that capture this connection. So he says, for instance, Marxian socialism and the dictatorship of the proletariat are merely the economic aspects of the doctrine of organic evolution. And he also says Marxian socialism and the radical criticism of the Bible are now proceeding hand in hand with the doctrine of organic evolution to break down morality, the sacredness of marriage and private property, on which Occidental civilization, Western civilization, has been built during the past 1,000 years. So that's his contention, and the book basically traces the evolution of this idea over the last century.
So it seems the book from its inception is really indebted to Seventh-day Adventists, which is really interesting. And you already touched upon many similarities, but according to creationists between Darwinism and Marxism. Could you tell us a little more about what makes Darwinism a red dynamite, both according to the creationists, you already told us a little about that, and also according to Marxists and socialists?
Sure. So I spend the first chapter of the book showing how generations of Marxists, the original founders, Marx and Engels, and Lenin and Trotsky, and their followers in the US and the Socialist Party and the early communist parties did give great support to evolutionary science. This chapter may rankle some people in that there is a sense, I think, among liberals, progressives, secular-minded academics, that this idea that evolution could possibly have anything to do with communism is some wild conspiracy theory that shouldn't be taken seriously. But I argue in the book that there's a grain of truth in this conspiracy theory, that in fact, Marx and Engels were big supporters of Darwin and evolutionary science. At Marx's funeral, Frederick Engels famously said that Marx had done in the field of human history what Darwin had done in natural history, and socialists continued to make those comparisons for decades. I mean, what do they potentially have in common? Well, Darwin's model of natural selection and Marx and Engels's understanding of history as powered by a class struggle and so on are both materialist. They formulate laws, dialectical laws, in fact, of how history unfolds. And of course, that unfolding doesn't require any supernatural agency to direct it. It just happens by itself. It doesn't require God. And conflict, struggle are essential parts of both of these ways of looking at the past. And we have testimony from various communists and socialists, like Leon Trotsky, who I quote in the book, who says that he was jailed for his activity organizing workers in his early days. And he says when he got into prison, he was attracted to the ideas of Marxism, but still couldn't quite make the final leap. But then when he read Darwin, that finally convinced him that you really didn't need any kind of supernatural agency, and that he said Darwin was like a mighty doorkeeper opening the door to the temple of the universe. And, to me, that's inspiring. Of course, to creationists, it's a horror story, and they'll point to quotes like that to prove, aha, you see, evolution is all about communism. And so, again, there's a grain of truth in what they said, but and there are also scholars who would challenge what I'm saying about this tight connection between Darwin and Marx. That is, there were other evolutionary thinkers that Marx kind of checked out at the time, and so on. But that's the basic story that I'm telling in the book. In July 1925, a trial took place in Dayton, Tennessee, that put evolution on trial. The defendant was John Scopes, a science teacher at the high school in Dayton, Tennessee. And this story is pretty well known in America and was made into a play and then a movie based on a play called Inherit the Wind. It's very well known, and people have written about it for 100 years almost. In my introduction, I put a different spin on it and argue that the real story of the trial and the real story of Dayton, Tennessee is quite different and actually connects with the themes that I write about in the book. That is communism, anti-communism, social evolution, and all the rest. And the short version is that John Scopes was the son of a socialist activist, Thomas Scopes, who arrived from England as an immigrant. He ended up working as a machinist. And one of the books he was carrying under his arm was Darwin's On the Origin of Species. And he raised John Scopes, young John Scopes, as a socialist. And John Scopes went to the University of Kentucky and got a degree in law. He's often perceived as a kind of hapless, naive victim of the trial. He was convicted of violating the state law in Tennessee that made it illegal to teach about human evolution. But I argue in the book that he was not a naive, hapless victim. He was actually, in his own way, a very political person. His father was very invested in the trial, came to Dayton, Tennessee for the 2 weeks of the trial. And so the scope, and then during the trial, John Scopes, the defendant, was red baited by a Christian conservative minister who said that Scopes had been raised by this dangerous socialist, and this is a dangerous kind of character, and so the trial is really not just about whether someone broke a law, but it's really about this plot to destroy America, communist plot to destroy America. So that fits into the theme of the book. The other piece of the Dayton story that's not really known at all is that it was in a coal mining region of Tennessee, and there was a lot of labor activism there, including in Dayton. There were repeated strikes that coal miners carried out. There was a branch of the United Mine Workers. The area saw actually a widespread struggle against the convict lease system in the 1890s, which predominantly targeted African-American convicts. And so Dayton was really swept up in this whole world that really becomes the center of the book, and it's just not recognized. It's often described as this sleepy little southern town that just kind of happens to be the place where the trial happened, and there's really no history to it. But there is, and at least I've started to explore that, and I think it's worth exploring further.
Got it. It's in your book you mentioned social Darwinism a lot, and usually, at least here in Brazil, social Darwinism is often associated with conservative, even fascistic stances of programs for society and economy. On the other hand, your book deals mostly with left-wing social Darwinism. What is the difference between right-wing and left-wing social Darwinism? Could you say that?
That's a great question. Yeah, and the story is the same in this country. That is, it's a standard part of the school curriculum that students probably in a U.S. history class in high school learn about social Darwinism. The idea is you're using scientific ideas for social and political purposes, and in this case, the classic cases are people like Andrew Carnegie or John D. Rockefeller, who essentially say that the inequalities in society are the result of a struggle for the survival of the fittest, and they just happen to have come out on top. That is, those inequalities that some people might rail against are part of the natural order. They're God ordained. Rockefeller famously said, "God gave me my money," and good for him. So that idea obviously then can be used to prop up the established social and political order, and those are ideas typically used by conservatives. But as I mentioned earlier, in fact, a whole range of socialist, communists, and even non-Marxist progressives found inspiration in Darwin as well. They saw that the idea that society evolves, the idea that this evolution is scientific, to them meant there could be something very progressive in thinking about evolution as a way of explaining society and improving society. So, I mean, I give as one example in the book a character who's not at all well known, but probably should be better known. He was a progressive and, in fact, socialist preacher who went to Union Theological Seminary in New York City. His name was Charles Browning Bouck, B-O-U-C-K. I don't know how he got his nickname, but he was known as Bouck White. He actually founded in 1914, I believe it was, a new church called the Church of the Social Revolution. He was definitely discontent with the established churches and their links to those with power and money and influence, and decided he needed to somehow connect Christianity to what he saw as its original roots. He actually wrote a book called Call of the Carpenter in 1911 that portrayed Jesus Christ as a proletarian revolutionary, and it was a very influential book. Eugene Debs, the famous American socialist, was apparently quite influenced by it. And so White saw the current way that Christianity was taught as a way to keep down workers, to exploit workers. And in that book about Jesus Christ, White explained that people in high, powerful positions denounced Darwin because in fact, they saw Darwin as a dangerous man, that his ideas could promote social revolt and revolution. And so I describe White in the book as a left-wing social Darwinist. That is, he saw Darwin as an ally in his campaign to change society, and yet he was doing it from a perspective that looked to socialism in the future as a desirable goal.
Yeah, so there's nothing to do between this social Darwinism that sees inequalities as God ordained, given by nature, and left-wing social Darwinism. So social Darwinists from the left are not fans of Rockefeller and stuff like that.
Exactly, quite the opposite. In fact, as I explained in that chapter in the book, White, this preacher in New York, in fact, confronted John D. Rockefeller Jr., who was a devout Baptist, as you may know, and he led a contingent of people to protest at Rockefeller Jr.'s church because at the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company out in Colorado, where workers were on strike, the company guards had just carried out an armed attack on some of the strikers and their families that became known as the Ludlow Massacre of 1914. So John D. Rockefeller himself, at least Jr., was directly involved in this episode.
Yeah, that's it's really inspiring to see a Christian do something like that. Not the Rockefeller stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
So coming into more familiar terrain for some of the Brazilians who will be watching this, you dedicate a whole chapter to Price, George McCready Price, and the Adventists. I'm just curious to hear what are your impressions as an outsider about the denomination's origin and its political inclinations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would say I started from ignorance since, at least in the US, Adventism is marginal. So I knew pretty much nothing about it and then learned a whole lot about it. And I was fascinated. I mean, I was fascinated by the millenarian roots, about the story of the Great Disappointment from 1844. And it really got me thinking about how, even though Adventism is seen as marginal and quite different, that really they were tapping into, in a sense, the mainstream of earliest Christianity. That is, Jesus of Nazareth was an apocalypticist, somebody who was foretelling a huge violent change that would bring the Son of Man to earth, which, at least in my understanding, did not refer to himself, but referred to someone who would come to take care of things. And I mean, at least I'm convinced by Reza Aslan's book, The Zealot, that understands Jesus as a political figure, broadly speaking, who was looking for better days under the oppression of the Roman Empire. And so I think that this basic idea that that Jesus will come again and there'll be this great change is really pretty foundational to Christianity, and not only to Christianity, I mean, in Judaism as well. There were all kinds of millenarian prophets going back hundreds and hundreds of years. So I found that really interesting, and I also found it fascinating that there were some aspects of Adventist theology, particularly the teachings of Ellen White, that bore directly on creationist ideas and then ended up being important parts of young earth creationism. I mean, she directly says the earth is about 6,000 years old. She directly says she went back in time and was there at creation, and these were 24-hour natural days. They weren't days that were long periods. And so if you're George McCready Price and you're a devout Adventist and you're trying to figure all this out, and of course you need to follow the spirit of prophecy, Ellen White, well, how can you not then say, yeah, the earth is 6,000 years old? And of course, there are Adventists who would say differently today, but still, it makes sense that Price took this approach. Even the Saturday Sabbath, And the fourth commandment about honoring the Sabbath, again, that's just another theological reason that pushed Price in the direction of young earth creationism. And he was very much an outlier in those early days. I mean, there were fundamentalists in the early 20th century who were disturbed by what they saw as a liberal direction in the church, who were considered part of the fundamentalist movement, but were not young earth creationists. Price was almost the only one in the early 20th century, and only much later did other evangelicals come around to that. So another thing that struck me about the Adventists, learning about the Adventists in doing the research, was their politics in the mid to late 19th century, which were remarkably progressive compared to what they later embraced in regard to racial equality, the Civil War, slavery, even the early years of Reconstruction. There's a really interesting book on this. And of course, that changed over time. But still, of course, Adventists welcomed African Americans into the fold, and that's still and that continued for decades. And so it was interesting to just see how the denomination started and how it evolved over time. So I really enjoyed learning about the Adventists, and I had the great advantage of getting to know Ronald Numbers, the internationally known historian of religion and science, an unusual academic, but somebody who grew up with an Adventist preacher as a father and knows the theology and all the rest deeply, and so was able to help correct errors that I made when I was trying to make sense of it. So that was super helpful in putting the research together.
Yeah, it's really curious when that you tell in your book how Price was pretty much the creator of the Red Dynamite relationship between Marxism and evolution in an environment where Adventists were so politically progressive, at least initially. So, as you said, regarding the Civil War, also regarding international politics, you even mentioned the anti-imperialist book, which is widely unknown here in Brazil. I wonder why. What would you say triggered this change in both in not only in Price but in Adventism in general? Is it related to fundamentalism, or I don't know?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a little bit hard to say, but I'm inclined to think that there were some pretty strong political pressures. I mean, you mentioned the book Denouncing Imperialism, and that's absolutely true. I mean, the whole anti-imperialist movement tended to get gravely weaken and crumble around the same time. I mean, there were people who were part of the anti-imperialist movement who in some ways were not really anti-imperialist in the sense that we would say today. That is, some of them were opposed to, say, annexing the Philippines because they didn't want Filipinos as American citizens, not because they had some principled objection to subjecting people to American rule. But, it's also worth pointing out that, and I do this in the book, that I was struck by this ambivalence that not only Price, but the editors of Science at the Times, other Adventist publications around the turn of the century had towards socialists. That is, they expressed a lot of sympathy for what the socialists were doing. And as you know, if you are embracing premillennial dispensationalism, in a strange way, bad news is good news. And so if there are dark storm clouds on the horizon, well, that means we're closer to Christ's second coming. And so there's something intriguing about this idea that intensified class conflict and the challenge of the socialists could mean that actually, I believe I quote a headline from one of the publications referring to the Russian Revolution. It's Bolshevism as a sign of Christ's coming, or something like that. So, but I think also Price was sympathetic genuinely to what the socialists were doing. He himself was, not a wealthy man and struggled to hold on to a job. And, I narrate a bit about his time in New York City, where he was practically starving and worried about his family and his spiritual salvation and all the rest. So at a time when the socialists were gaining a lot of support. So that's part of the story too.
Great. So Price's discourses about the dangers of evolution and socialism echoes idealist metaphysical discourses such as man's evil nature and things like that, which are used against Marxism to this day. Why are Marxism and evolution viewed as so dangerous to conservative idealists, upholders of the social order?
That's a really good question. I mean, a couple of things come to mind. I mean, I would, to start with, just say that, at least I would claim that Marxism 100 years ago, as I narrate in the book, offered working people a scientific understanding of the world. And that's always dangerous. I mean, there's a couple of places in the book where the characters I'm writing about make the observation, and there's, I think, a socialist in one case, maybe Arthur Merrill Lewis at one point, and then later one of the early communists, point out that the employers of the time, those who had the wealth and power, found themselves between a rock and a hard place, in a contradictory situation, in that you need science to run industry, and yet you actually don't want workers to adopt a scientific understanding of things, and yet it's impossible to prevent them from having access to scientific ideas. And Arthur Merrill Lewis, who was a socialist in Chicago, would give lectures to working class audiences, and insisted that even though many workers might have religious faith or religious ideas, that evolutionary ideas could be understood by them, and they should be approached and taught science, and that it was in their great interest to do so. So I mean, that's one way in which I think that Marxist ideas were dangerous. As far as Darwinian ideas, I think it's much the same thing. I mean, if you think about the current day opposition to evolutionary science that we see at the Creation Museum and so on, that opposition tends to focus not on biological evolution, but social evolution. I make this point in the book. That is to say, the big issues at the Creation Museum, if you really peel back all of the pseudo-scientific text and arguments, are culture war issues like abortion and gay marriage. They just opened, in fact, a new exhibit on abortion at the museum. That happened after my book came out. And I think that's really significant, because it actually is more honest about what their agenda is. And so they're, in some ways, their primary objection to Darwinism has nothing to do with biology. It has to do with the idea that society can change, that morality can change. Our ideas of what's right and wrong can change. And in some ways, I think those who uphold the current social order are always disturbed by this idea that people may think that abortion is okay, that women should have the right to control their bodies. Going back 50 years, that racial segregation is wrong. And I spent a little time in the book showing how people influenced by creationist kind of ideas saw racial segregation as God ordained, as part of the order that God created, and going back to the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis and so on. So I think that both ideas combined tend to offer justification for social change in profound ways, and I think that's always disturbing to those who are running society.
Yeah, I'm always reminded of an evolutionary biologist, Michael Gislin. He wrote in a book of him called Metaphysics and the Origin of Species, that for Darwin, as for Heraclitus, change was a fundamental reality.
That's right.
Yeah, social evolution as a danger to conservatives is all about that.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, one of the things I do address in the first chapter of the book is somewhat more of a subtle issue, which is to what extent socialists and Marxist communists would combine the idea of social and biological evolution. And in fact, Marx and certainly Lenin was insistent that this was a mistake, that we want to recognize that, of course, social and biological evolution are intertwined, but they're not the same thing. So we don't want to treat the evolution of human society, we don't want to treat human society as an organism that experiences natural selection in a literal sense. But there were people like Bogdanov and others in the Bolshevik Party who actually made this argument, and that ended up being part of a major political split that happened.
Professor, Marx, in afterword of the second edition of Capital, he writes that where the bourgeoisie conquered the power, the class struggle, and I quote, assumed theoretical and practically increasingly accentuated and threatening forms. It sounded the death knell for bourgeoisie scientific economics. It was no longer a matter of knowing whether these or sorry, because my computer is not helping me to read this text. It was no longer a matter of knowing whether this or that theorem was true, but whether, for capital, it was useful or harmful, comfortable or uncomfortable, whether or not it contradicted the policy orders. That's how Marx explained some problem in the afterword of second edition of Capital. In your point of view, can we paraphrase or broaden the question to a general scientific framework, given the conflict of biological science? Because this point.
If I understand your question correctly, I think there's quite a connection to what I write about in the book. In fact, I mean, I've already mentioned that for the creationists, the way they would judge truth claims is whether or not believing a certain thing would make you act in a certain way. And that is, and there are a couple of places, there are a few quotations in the book where they'll just explicitly acknowledge that it really has nothing to do with the evidence. It really has nothing to do with comparing claims with what you can observe in the natural world, but rather whether believing in an idea leads to certain consequences, whether it leads to people behaving in a certain way. And if it does that, then they know better than if they had examined evidence that this idea is invalid. You know, that there's I believe Gerald Winrod, the Kansas creationist that I mentioned, at one point says that, you know, that the common people's common sense is all that's really needed to judge these ideas. And so there's this populist flavor to the way that a number of these folks talk about evolution and its claims. It's insincere because, of course, people like Winrod, William Bell Riley, J. Frank Norris, who we haven't talked about, another fiery populist. I mean, when they taught about the Bible, it was my way or the highway. It was J. Frank Norris's interpretation. It was William Bell Riley's interpretation. So there really wasn't any latitude for people having their own interpretation, making up their own minds. And of course, ultimately, these folks were not about empowering working people. But there was this rhetoric, this populist rhetoric, that anybody can determine the truth. And the truth is ultimately judged by this idea that ideas have consequences. And so perhaps there's a connection there, the way Marx is describing how the bourgeoisie decided what ideas were valid based on whether they served their policies or not. And I think this is an important point in the book, in that a lot of well-meaning people may think that the creationists, the people who run the Creationist Museum, including some of the people with Ph.D s, really are guided by evidence in some ways, that they're really looking at this data and then coming to some conclusion. And it's a tricky thing too, because I don't argue in the book that people are deliberately lying and saying, you know, this is what we believe, but then they go in a back room and laugh with their friends about how that's got nothing to do with it. I think there's some self-deception going on, because if you would admit to yourself that the science is really bogus, then what are you doing? What are you doing at the Creation Museum? Why are you spending millions of dollars? Why are you setting up exhibits and all the rest? So it can be hard to really pin down the dynamics of how this works, but I do think that's an important part of what I'm raising in the book.
So despite their foundational role in the movement, Price and the Seventh-day Adventists seem to lose protagonism along the history of creationism and fundamentalism, even though Adventists closely followed both trends, claiming to be the fundamentalists of the fundamentalists. What do you think kept them on the fringes? That's also the case here in Brazil. We are also a marginal denomination compared to the other evangelicals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting story. Henry Morris, John Whitcomb Jr., and others deliberately put Adventists on the margins. I think that's at least one part of how this happened. And I'm not at all the first person to write about this. Ron Numbers wrote about it extensively in his book, The Creationist, but I have added to that story. And so in his early years in the 1940s, Henry Morris, who later becomes the head of the Institute for Creation Research and really the best known American creationist for decades, in his early years when he was a college student, he read George McCready Price and was profoundly inspired. I mean, he says it had a profound impact on me. And he loved Price's writing. Morris, although he became a hydraulic engineer, he was hoping to become a journalist in his early days. But it was the ideas. It was the idea that, it was the impression that Morris got that Price had provided a scientific foundation for the claim of a young Earth. And so Morris was inspired. He joined the Deluge History Society and started following Price's writings, read everything he could get his hands on. And of course, then John Whitcomb, later on, operating at that point independently from Morris, wrote a Ph.D. dissertation that became the book, The Genesis Flood. And in order for it to actually be publishable, Morris had to work on it quite a bit, because Whitcomb wrote it just based on the authority of Scripture. There was no science in it whatsoever. And yet it was claiming to explain geological history. So the two of them collaborated, and in the process of turning it into a book, they corresponded back and forth about what to do about Price. And what Morris said essentially was, Price can't be in this book. You know, he's an embarrassment. You know, he's not going to help our case. And so they essentially took him out. And in fact, there's a letter that, if I remember correctly, Morris wrote to a biographer of Price, where the biographer asked Morris about Price's influence. And Morris is something like, well, he did have some influence, but it was rather indirect. and that's just so much not the case. But that version of the story has been quite influential. I found that out when I interviewed John Morris, one of the sons of Henry Morris. He was then, and maybe still, one of the central leaders of the Institute for Creation Research, now in Dallas, Texas, used to be in Southern California. And Morris, I asked Morris about Price, and he said, you know, I don't think my dad was much influenced by Price. And Price, wasn't he a preacher? No, he wasn't. So that was quite striking. And I mean, I didn't really know what to expect. I didn't really expect much out of him, but it ended up being surprisingly revealing that Henry Morris's son and himself, a leading creationist, saw Price in that way. So I think that marginalization was successful. Of course, I would say that Price's marginalization and Adventist marginalization is obviously not due only to what Henry Morris and John Whitcomb were doing. It's a much broader story, but it is interesting to me how that happened, and that's certainly part of that story.
Yeah, that's a really interesting and funny story as well.
Indeed.
Yeah, so driving away a little bit from the Adventists, you documented consistent connections of creationists and fundamentalists with white supremacists, male chauvinists, and even Nazi fascist movements throughout American history. Why do you think that happens, and how does anti-communism tie into that?
Well, in my chapter where I talk about John R. Rice, a leading fundamentalist of the mid-20th century, there's a quotation from Rice, and in this context, he's actually talking about his view of women and women who step out of their prescribed gender roles as being disturbing and dangerous in all kinds of ways. And he says, he reminds his readers in that pamphlet, he says, "The heart of sin is rebellion against authority." And I think this is a key line that's important to keep in mind because, of course, it connects with Christian theology in all sorts of ways. But it's also a political line, rebellion against authority. That can mean a lot of things to people, but he spells it out. He says that means servants must obey their masters, children must obey their parents, women must obey their husbands, and citizens must obey their governments. And so if you think about the kinds of movements that you mentioned, whether they have to do with racial oppression, the oppression of women by men, or the Nazi movement in the 20th century, I think there's something in common there. That is to say, these are movements that are, in many cases, resisting efforts by people to find their way out from oppression, exploitation, that is to gain power. It's all about power. And I would say that at least at its best, the communist movement that I document in the book, at least in its early years, aimed to empower people in all kinds of ways. I understand communists aren't viewed that way today by most people, but I would say the genuine communists that I document in the book were engaged in that project, and not simply to empower workers, but they understood that the labor movement and the effort to empower workers was intertwined with efforts to empower women. I spent some time looking at the early Bolshevik program for the emancipation of women in the early Soviet Union. Also along the lines of race, that is, communists and socialists in general were far out in front of everyone else in terms of their activism against racial segregation and discrimination, lynching, and all the rest. And so if you want to weaken all of those movements, taking aim against communists, in fact, makes some sense. There's some logic there. And I think that that's certainly part of the explanation for what you're describing. I will say, I would just like to highlight the one part of the story that I tell that does have to do with the Nazi Party in Germany and creationist relation to it. Now, there were prominent fundamentalist, conservative evangelicals who detested Hitler and the Nazi Party and spoke against them. That's absolutely true. But there were also some prominent ones, particularly William Bell Riley, who was pastor of the First Baptist Church in Minneapolis, and Gerald Winrod, who created and edited the Defender magazine, was widely influential out in Kansas. Both of them openly and enthusiastically supported Hitler and the Nazi Party in the 1930s, at least until the U.S. entered World War at least until the U.S. entered World War II. And they both Riley and Winrod, grabbed onto the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the famous fabricated conspiracy document, and used it for all it was worth, and just fully embraced these fantastical, wild, and horrible ideas about the power that Jews had over every event in human history. And one thing that was interesting to me, which I didn't know, was that the protocols, which is a made-up document, but still, that the protocols actually specifically say that Jews have developed Marxism and Darwinism to demoralize the Christian masses, to create chaos so that they can then foist their own Jewish ruler on the world. So this Red Dynamite message that I document in the book is in effect built into the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And so, of course, Hitler was quite a fan, and was a fan of prominent Americans who promoted the protocols, like Henry Ford, the auto magnate. So, so that's an important part of the story, and of course, one that evangelicals don't want to hear about. That is, William Bell Riley was an extremely influential evangelical in the Midwest. He was sometimes called the grand old man of Midwestern fundamentalism. His Northwestern Bible Institute trained dozens, if not hundreds, of Christian ministers throughout the Midwest in the mid-20th century. I mean, somebody who just was not at all a marginal figure, and yet here he is publicly praising Hitler.
Yeah, it's really curious. That ties into the next question, but it's really curious that you documented all that, because oftentimes, currently, creationists will say that the Nazi movement in Germany only happened because of Darwinism and evolution, and that it was all about evolution, and eugenics was all about evolution as well. And
that's right. And actually, it's worth noting, and I note this briefly in the book, that William Bell Riley did change his tune on Hitler. I think it was about 1940. As I said, that was the turning point when it became clear that the U.S. would get into the war, and that it wouldn't look good for him to be praising Hitler. So he then did write a pamphlet about how, as you say, Hitler was inspired by evolution. Hitler was the ultimate example of, evolution gone mad. If you believe we're descended from animals, you'll act like animals. And so Hitler was the ultimate bestial ruler. It's interesting, though, if you read that pamphlet, Riley says not a single word about Jews. Zero, nothing. So, and that's consistent with his attempt to depict Jews as communists. That's what in Riley's view during the 1930s, Hitler is not anti-Jewish, he's just anti-communist, and we're anti-communist, so we're embracing him.
Yeah, and talking about that change in Riley, your book also tells how, through the end of the Cold War, the creationists' political rhetoric changed from being explicitly anti-communist to a focus on horseshoe theories, equating Nazis and socialists, and the struggle against secular humanism through the Institute for Creation Research and Library Fellowship, for example. How does this shift represent a continuity from earlier creationists and fundamentalists, or a change?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's both change and continuity. Francis Schaeffer, who founded Library Fellowship in Switzerland, a famous Christian evangelist, and a very sharp guy, and a quirky character for sure, in 1981 published a book called Christian Manifesto, one of his best-known works. And if you want to know whether the continuity between communism as the bogeyman, as the enemy, if you want to know whether that continuity between that and secular humanism is a real thing, all you have to look at is the very front of the book, where on one page, Schaeffer prints at the top of the page, Communist Manifesto, then Humanist Manifesto number 1, and then Humanist Manifesto number 2. That is, he's telling his readers, these are genealogically related here, and not much has changed. So, in fact, in that book, he doesn't say much about communism and Marxism, but I do, in my book, show how he's still continuing the tradition that has been developing behind him for decades. Similarly, if you read Tim LaHaye's Battle for the Mind, published right around the same time, 1980, and LaHaye is somebody who really popularizes this war against secular humanism. You know, Schaeffer is a little bit more of an intellectual. LaHaye, whatever else he was not an intellectual, but he knew how to go for the juggler, the political juggler. And in this book, he warns about secular humanism, but the ultimate nightmare scenario for LaHaye is what he calls the one world socialist state. So even though he's talking about secular humanism, and you might argue that in 1981, communism is not perceived as perhaps the threat that it was in the 1960s, although the Cold War is still going on, socialism is still the focus of his writing. I mean, similarly, Jerry Falwell in 1980, in a book called Listen America, he explicitly references Karl Marx and his evolutionary beliefs. And then one of my favorites, right around the same time, maybe 1980, very interesting character, Richard Wurmbrand, originally from Romania, became famous in the 60s for stripping his shirt off in a congressional hearing, showing the scars that he received for being a militant Christian in a communist country. He wrote a book called Marx and Satan, which makes the case that Marx was literally a Satanist. So, you know, this is happening at the time when secular humanism is becoming more of the concern, and concerns about Marxism are supposedly fading, but not entirely, because if you go to I believe it's still there, I showed this, one of the illustrations in my book is a photo I took at what had been the ICR Institute for Creation Research Museum in Santee, California, near San Diego. You know, we talked about we talked about social Darwinism earlier. In that museum, there are the typical conservative social Darwinists up on a wall called the Hall of Scholars, but towering above them is a portrait of Karl Marx. And the panel describing Marx says that Marx was a professing Christian as a young person, which is true, but then, according to some, was a Satanist. And that was put up in the early 1990s. That is, the Cold War was over, but that didn't matter for ICR. They were still targeting communists and socialists. And again, I took that photo about 10 years ago. I don't have any reason to think it's been taken down, but I guess we'd have to go out there and find out.
Yeah, here in Brazil, we see this. We've seen this come full circle with not only creationists but far-right speakers in general, connecting the cultural war against secular humanism to a war against cultural Marxism, using Gramsci and authors like that. I've been wondering if you saw that connection being made by creationists as well, or something like that.
It's not something I wrote about in the book very much at all, but it's definitely rife here in the States. And as I do say in the book, and perhaps it's in the epilogue, that contrary to anyone's expectation, in 2016, you had an election in which accusations of communism and socialism were at the center of the campaign. Who would have expected that? You know, really the same thing in 2020. So strangely, decades after the end of the Cold War, this whole rhetoric has been revived, and anti-communism is actually alive and well in the country. And definitely this charge of culture Marxism is part of it. I mean, of course, the current rage around critical race theory in the States fits into this perspective. One of the organizations that I talk about in the book is D. James Kennedy Ministries, Coral Ridge Ministries down in Florida. And D. James Kennedy is gone, but his compatriots have carried on his cause. And I would say, and I quote from one of their publications right at the end of the book, and I would say they've been in the forefront of continuing this campaign to link Marxism to these identity politics issues, these cultural issues, to the present day. I'm not sure how much of a following they have, to be honest. It's hard to know, but they definitely have a deep history as part of this story that I tell in the book. So I do think they're worth taking seriously.
Okay, since you mentioned your epilogue, you finish your book with many instances of Red Dynamite blowing up today. As you mentioned, communism and socialism accusations popping out everywhere, especially from the Trump election onwards. Even an Adventist, Ben Carson, comes back into the fray in a moment when class struggle is more alive than ever. So is there a final message we would like to send to socialists and progressive evangelicals who still want to make the world a better place and believe society can change?
Big question.
Yeah.
Well, let me just say something real quick about Ben Carson, because again, he's the sort of figure who would simply be made fun of, and was made fun of and insulted in all kinds of ways by progressives and liberals and Democrats in this country, and perhaps some of that ridicule is deserved. But I hope you and anybody who's read the book notice that that's not my game. I didn't write this book to make fun of Christian conservatives, to insult them in any way, but simply to tell this history and to try to understand, as a way of understanding the world we're living in today. So I will get to your question, but I'll just point out for anybody who hasn't read the book that I tell a story of Ben Carson in the 2016 campaign. Of course, he was a contender at one point for the Republican nomination. And there were two parts of it. One is that an old video surfaced, and I'm sure somebody found it to try to discredit Carson, where he was talking about evolution, I think to a church group, to an Adventist group. And he explained that he thought that Charles Darwin's ideas were brought to him by the adversary, that is, by the devil. And people just went over the top making fun of him. But as I point out, for one thing, this makes total sense in terms of Adventist theology, but it also is completely consistent with claims that Henry Morris and others were making for decades. Morris in particular, in several of his books, and this is, it's right there in black and white in his books, he is making the claim very specifically that Satan is behind evolution. That is the idea. And of course, if you believe that, if you believe Satan is real and you believe Satan is behind evolution, well then it doesn't matter what the evidence for evolution is. Nothing else matters. Evolution is bad and has to be stopped. And that's a kind of logic that I trace in the book that I think is really important to understand. Again, if you're a secular-minded person, you don't think Satan is real and all the rest, it may sound ridiculous. But to millions of people around the world, and I understand those include probably millions of people in Brazil, that's not a joke. That's serious. I do think there are ways of getting through to people, and so let me address your basic question. I'll say for myself, I didn't write this book as a political manifesto, but I'm happy to say I'm inspired by the pioneer Marxists that I talk about in the book, who offered a materialist analysis of religion, but also understood that attacking the religious convictions of ordinary people is a political dead end and actually counterproductive to any project of changing the world. Marx is famous for saying religion is the opium of the people. But before he said that, what he said was religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. Then he said, it is the opium of the people. And if you just read it's the opium of the people, you really don't get it. If you read the rest, you start to see that he had I think a profound understanding of what religion meant to people. And of course, he was not a believer, neither am I. But I think that having some understanding of where religious ideas come from, or at least claiming to, is extremely important. And I also referenced Lenin in the book and his advice to Bolsheviks. He said in a 1909 article, he said that it would be a mistake to declare war on religion. which many of them were inclined to want to do. And then, Lenin offered his own materialist explanation for where, at least in his view, religious faith comes from, and it has to do with, in his view, the limited power people have over their lives and what happens around them. And he said his view of how to confront and deal with religious, say, objections to plans for social change would be to increase workers' sense of power and control over social and political life. And that's my paraphrase. And so I guess as somebody who would like to see the world change fundamentally, and yet recognize that, of course, a lot of people have religious ideas that may give them hesitations about, I don't know, supporting abortion rights or joining labor unions or whatever. Ellen White, of course, was not a fan of labor unions either. That approaching people where they are and joining with them to fight for things that people agree need to happen, which have to do with their basic political rights and their conditions of life and their challenges they face on the job and all the rest, is the way to go. So I would also just say that the fact that I've written a book on conservative Christians that does not insult conservative Christians, I would attribute not to the fact that I'm just a really good guy, but also that I've had some political experience with socialist revolutionaries who've taught me that won't do it.